The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan village of Sangin when Lieutenant Sarah Martinez received the radio call that would change everything. Her unit had been stationed at the remote outpost for 3 months, and the intelligence reports had been unusually quiet for weeks. Too quiet, as her sergeant often reminded the squad. Sarah was only 24 years old, fresh out of the military academy with honors in tactical operations. Her fellow soldiers respected her sharp mind, but many questioned whether she had the physical and mental stamina for prolonged combat. She was smaller than most of her team, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight build that made her appear even younger than her years. The outpost itself was nothing more than a collection of fortified buildings surrounded by sandbags and razor wire. 12 soldiers called it home, including Sarah and her trusted communications specialist, Corporal James Wilson. The isolation was complete. The nearest friendly forces were 40 miles away across treacherous mountain terrain that vehicles couldn't navigate. As Sarah reviewed the morning patrol reports, Wilson burst into her makeshift office with urgency written across his face. His radio was crackling with intercepted enemy communications, and what he had heard made his blood run cold. A large insurgent force was moving toward their position under cover of the pre-dawn darkness. Conservative estimates put their numbers at over 60 fighters, armed with rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and automatic weapons. The tactical situation was grim beyond measure. Sarah's small unit was outnumbered 5 to 1, with limited ammunition and no possibility of immediate reinforcement. The closest helicopter landing zone was 3 miles away through open ground that would be suicide to cross under enemy fire. Even if they could call for air support, the response time would be at least 6 hours due to weather conditions grounding most aircraft in the region. Sarah gathered her team in the main bunker and laid out the harsh reality. They could attempt to evacuate immediately, but that would mean crossing exposed terrain in daylight with civilians from the nearby village, likely caught in the crossfire. The alternative was to stay and fight, buying precious time for the villagers to escape and for reinforcements to organize a rescue mission. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah looked into the eyes of her soldiers and saw the same determination she felt burning in her own chest. These weren't just military objectives they were protecting. There were families in that village, children who played soccer with the soldiers during quiet afternoons, elderly people who had shown them kindness despite the language barriers. Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran with 2 previous deployments, voiced what everyone was thinking. The enemy would expect them to run or surrender when faced with such overwhelming odds. No reasonable military commander would choose to stay and fight in these circumstances. It seemed impossible that such a small force could hold out against a sustained assault. But Sarah had spent countless hours studying military history, particularly the stories of small units that had achieved the impossible through tactical brilliance and sheer determination. She knew that defensive positions, when properly utilized, could multiply a force's effectiveness exponentially. The outpost had been constructed with exactly this scenario in mind, with overlapping fields of fire and reinforced positions that could withstand significant bombardment. As the distant sound of vehicles approached, Sarah made her final preparations. She distributed the remaining ammunition carefully, ensuring each position had enough to maintain sustained fire. The heavy machine gun was repositioned to cover the most likely avenue of approach, while the sniper took his position in the highest tower with clear sightlines in all directions. The radio crackled one final time before the battle began. Command was asking for their status and requesting an immediate situation report. Sarah keyed the microphone and spoke with a calm voice that belied the chaos about to unfold. She informed headquarters that they were in position and ready to engage a superior enemy force. Her final words before signing off were simple but profound. They would hold the line for as long as humanly possible. Wilson looked at his lieutenant with a mixture of admiration and concern. He had served with many officers, but none had ever inspired such confidence in the face of certain doom. Sarah checked her weapon one last time, said a silent prayer for her family back home, and took her position at the command post. The enemy was now visible through binoculars, spreading out in attack formations that spoke of professional military training. The first shots would ring out in less than 10 minutes, beginning what would become one of the most remarkable defensive actions in recent military history. Sarah Martinez, the young officer whom many had doubted, was about to prove that courage comes in all sizes, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes rise to meet the greatest challenges. The first mortar round exploded 50 meters short of the perimeter, sending a column of dirt and debris skyward. Sarah felt the ground shake beneath her feet as she pressed herself against the reinforced wall of the command bunker. The enemy had begun their assault with a systematic bombardment designed to soften the defenses before the ground attack commenced. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the insurgent forces moving with disciplined precision. They weren't the disorganized militia fighters her unit had encountered in previous engagements. These were well-trained soldiers who understood military tactics and had clearly studied the outpost's defensive layout. Their advance was coordinated, with covering fire teams providing suppression while assault groups moved from position to position. The radio in Wilson's hands suddenly came alive with frantic chatter. Multiple enemy units were calling in grid coordinates and requesting fire missions from their mortar teams. Sarah realized with growing alarm that the insurgents had professional military communications equipment and were coordinating their attack with the same level of sophistication as a regular army unit. Sergeant Rodriguez crawled over to Sarah's position as bullets began, snapping overhead with increasing frequency. His weathered face was grim as he reported that the perimeter guards had spotted at least 3 separate assault groups approaching from different directions. The enemy wasn't just attacking head-on, they were attempting to surround the outpost and cut off any possibility of escape or reinforcement. Sarah made a critical tactical decision that would define the entire battle. Instead of spreading her limited forces thin to defend every possible approach, she would concentrate her firepower on the main attack while using carefully positioned observers to monitor the flanking movements. It was a calculated risk that required perfect timing and communication between all defensive positions. The heavy machine gun opened up with its distinctive rapid-fire chatter, sending streams of tracer rounds toward the advancing enemy fighters. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old and on his first deployment, was behind the gun with steady hands despite the terror that must have been coursing through his system. His accurate fire forced an entire enemy squad to take cover behind a low stone wall. As the battle intensified, Sarah moved constantly between positions, coordinating the defense and ensuring that no sector was left undefended for too long. She could see that several of her soldiers were beginning to show signs of stress. The overwhelming enemy numbers were having a psychological effect that threatened to undermine their fighting effectiveness. The enemy's first serious probe came from the eastern approach, where a team of 8 fighters attempted to rush the wire under cover of suppressive fire from their colleagues. Sarah directed concentrated fire from 2 positions, and the attack was repelled with heavy casualties among the insurgents. The bodies lying in the wire served as a grim reminder of the stakes involved in this desperate fight. Wilson suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm and pointed toward the village in the distance. Smoke was rising from several buildings, and the sound of gunfire could be heard even over the noise of the battle at the outpost. A separate enemy force was attacking the civilian population, either to prevent their escape or to create additional pressure on the defending soldiers. The realization that innocent people were under attack while her unit was pinned down filled Sarah with a cold rage that sharpened her tactical thinking. She quickly radioed the situation to headquarters, emphasizing the urgent need for air support or artillery to break up the enemy formations before they could overwhelm both the outpost and the village simultaneously. The response from command was devastating news. All available aircraft were grounded due to a sudden sandstorm that had moved into the region, and the nearest artillery units were already engaged in supporting another operation 60 miles to the south. Sarah and her team were completely on their own for the foreseeable future. As if sensing the defenders' isolation, the enemy intensified their assault. Rocket-propelled grenades began impacting the outer defenses with increasing accuracy, and Sarah could see her carefully constructed defensive positions beginning to take serious damage. Several sections of sandbag walls had been blown apart, creating gaps in the perimeter that would be difficult to defend. Private Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite sharing a surname, was wounded when shrapnel from a close explosion tore through his left shoulder. The young medic, Corporal Thompson, crawled through intense fire to reach him and began applying field dressings while bullets snapped inches above their heads. The sight of her soldiers' blood on the ground filled Sarah with determination that bordered on fury. She grabbed the radio and called out to her scattered team with a voice that cut through the chaos of battle. Her words were simple but carried the weight of absolute conviction. They would not give ground. They would not abandon the villagers, and they would make the enemy pay dearly for every meter they attempted to advance. The responding calls from her soldiers carried a renewed sense of purpose and defiance that would sustain them through the long hours ahead. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, turning the battlefield into a furnace that sapped strength from both sides. Sarah wiped sweat and dust from her eyes as she assessed the damage from the morning's fighting. 3 hours into the battle, her small force had repelled 4 major assaults, but the cost was becoming apparent in both ammunition and casualties. Sergeant Rodriguez crawled up to her position with troubling news. Their ammunition supply was down to 60% of starting levels, and at the current rate of consumption, they would be critically low within 2 hours. Worse still, the enemy seemed to have an unlimited supply of fighters and weapons, with fresh reinforcements visible in the distance moving toward the battle. The tactical situation had evolved into something resembling the siege warfare of centuries past. The insurgents had established covered positions around the outpost, and were maintaining steady pressure while avoiding the direct assaults that had cost them heavily in the morning. They seemed content to let time and ammunition shortages work in their favor. Sarah realized that passive defense would ultimately lead to defeat. She needed to disrupt the enemy's rhythm and force them to make mistakes that her defenders could exploit. The plan she formulated was audacious and dangerous, a series of limited counterattacks designed to keep the insurgents off balance and unable to consolidate their positions. The first counterattack came at midday when the heat was most oppressive. Sarah led a 3-person team in a lightning raid against an enemy mortar position that had been causing significant damage to their defenses. Moving through a dried creek bed that provided concealment, they approached to within 30 meters before opening fire with devastating effect. The surprise was complete. The enemy mortar crew was eliminated before they could react, and Sarah's team destroyed the weapon with a well-placed grenade. However, the return trip to their lines proved more dangerous as alerted enemy forces converged on their position from multiple directions. Wilson, monitoring enemy communications from the command post, guided the raiding party back through gaps in the enemy coverage using intercepted radio transmissions. His ability to understand fragments of the enemy's language proved invaluable, as he warned Sarah of attempted ambushes and directed her team toward safer routes. The psychological effect of the successful raid was immediately apparent. Enemy radio chatter became more frantic and disorganized as commanders struggled to understand how such a small force could mount offensive operations while under siege. Sarah could sense their growing frustration and uncertainty, emotions that she hoped to exploit further. But the enemy wasn't passive either. They adapted quickly to the new dynamic, establishing better security around their positions and coordinating more effectively to prevent future raids. A particularly clever insurgent commander positioned snipers to cover the creek bed approach, making future use of that route extremely dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, the battle settled into a deadly routine of probing attacks and defensive responses. The enemy would concentrate fire on one section of the perimeter, attempt to advance under that covering fire, and then be driven back by the accurate shooting of Sarah's defenders. Each repulse cost the insurgents casualties, but it also consumed precious ammunition that the defenders couldn't replace. The heat became an enemy in itself. Several soldiers on both sides succumbed to heat exhaustion, and Sarah had to carefully manage her team's water supplies while maintaining their fighting effectiveness. The metal of weapons became too hot to touch without gloves, and the air shimmered with waves of heat that made accurate long-range shooting increasingly difficult. Private Johnson, still manning the heavy machine gun despite having been in continuous combat for over 5 hours, began showing signs of severe fatigue. His rate of fire became more erratic, and Sarah could see that his hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. She made the difficult decision to rotate him out of the position, despite the tactical risk involved in moving personnel during active combat. The enemy seemed to sense the defenders' growing exhaustion and launched their most coordinated assault yet. Simultaneous attacks from 3 directions tested every aspect of Sarah's defensive plan, forcing her to make split-second decisions about where to concentrate her limited firepower for maximum effect. The western assault nearly succeeded in breaching the perimeter when a well-placed rocket-propelled grenade destroyed a section of protective wall and created a gap large enough for enemy fighters to exploit. Only the quick thinking of Corporal Thompson who abandoned his medical duties to grab an assault rifle and engage the advancing insurgents at close range, prevented a complete breakthrough. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sarah took stock of their situation with growing concern. Her force had been reduced to 8 effective fighters. Ammunition was running critically low, and the enemy showed no signs of weakening in their resolve to overrun the position. The longest and most dangerous phase of the battle was yet to come. The approaching darkness would favor the attacking force and test the defenders' courage to its absolute limits. Darkness fell across the battlefield like a curtain, transforming the tactical situation in ways that heavily favored the attacking force. Sarah knew that night operations would test her small unit's cohesion and discipline more severely than anything they had faced during the daylight hours. The enemy could now move with greater concealment, coordinate attacks more effectively, and potentially infiltrate the defensive perimeter without being detected until it was too late. The temperature dropped dramatically with the disappearance of the sun, providing relief from the oppressive heat but creating new challenges for the exhausted defenders. Night vision equipment was limited to 2 sets of goggles, forcing Sarah to make difficult decisions about where to position these critical assets for maximum effectiveness. Wilson had been monitoring enemy communications throughout the day, and his reports painted an ominous picture of the insurgents' nighttime intentions. They were bringing up additional heavy weapons under cover of darkness, including what appeared to be a recoilless rifle capable of destroying the remaining defensive positions with devastating precision. The first sign of the enemy's renewed offensive came as a series of illumination flares fired high into the night sky. The harsh white light revealed the battlefield in stark detail, casting eerie shadows that made it difficult to distinguish between enemy fighters and natural terrain features. Sarah realized immediately that the insurgents were using these flares to coordinate a major assault. The attack began with unprecedented intensity. Multiple enemy teams advanced simultaneously from different directions, using the periods of darkness between flares to close the distance to the defensive perimeter. Sarah could hear the sound of wire cutters working in the darkness as infiltration teams attempted to breach the obstacles surrounding the outpost. Sergeant Rodriguez, now wounded in the leg from earlier fighting but still combat effective, spotted movement near the eastern wire and opened fire with controlled bursts that forced the infiltrators to take cover. His accurate shooting disrupted what appeared to be a coordinated attempt to breach the perimeter at its weakest point. The situation became increasingly chaotic as enemy forces pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. Sarah found herself moving constantly between defensive positions, coordinating fire, and providing encouragement to soldiers who had been fighting for over 8 hours without rest. The physical and mental strain was beginning to show on every face, but their resolve remained unbroken. A critical moment came when enemy fighters managed to reach the outer wire barrier and began cutting systematic gaps for follow-on forces to exploit. Sarah made the dangerous decision to lead a small team outside the main perimeter to engage these infiltrators at close range before they could complete their work. The close-quarters battle that followed was intense and personal. Fighting in near-total darkness with only muzzle flashes for illumination, Sarah and her 2 volunteers engaged enemy fighters at ranges of less than 10 meters. The sound of grenades and automatic weapons fire echoed across the night landscape as both sides fought with desperate fury. Wilson's voice crackled over the radio with urgent intelligence gathered from intercepted communications. The enemy commander was repositioning his forces for what appeared to be a final, overwhelming assault designed to crush the remaining defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Conservative estimates suggested that over 40 fighters would participate in this coordinated attack. Sarah managed to fight her way back to the main defensive line just as the enemy's climactic assault began. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the air, battlefield in deadly patterns, and the sound of explosions created a continuous thunderous roar that made communication between positions extremely difficult. The heavy machine gun position came under concentrated attack from multiple rocket-propelled grenades, and Private Johnson was forced to abandon his weapon when the position became untenable. The loss of this critical fire support system created a significant gap in the defensive coverage that Sarah had to address immediately. She made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Rather than trying to re-establish the machine gun position, she ordered a general withdrawal to the inner defensive perimeter. a series of reinforced bunkers that had been prepared as a last-ditch fallback position. This tactical retreat would concentrate her remaining forces, but also surrender significant ground to the enemy. The withdrawal was executed under intense fire, with each soldier covering the movement of his colleagues while maintaining disciplined fire toward the advancing enemy forces. Sarah was the last to leave each position, ensuring that no equipment or wounded personnel were left behind for the insurgents to capture or exploit. As her small force consolidated in the inner perimeter, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving through the positions they had just abandoned. The insurgents were now closer than ever to achieving their objective, but they had also entered the killing zone, where the remaining defenders could bring concentrated fire to bear on any approaching targets. Corporal Thompson, despite being wounded earlier in the battle, had managed to keep all the casualties stable and combat-ready. His medical expertise had been crucial in maintaining the unit's fighting strength throughout the long day and night of continuous combat. The ammunition situation had become critical, with most soldiers down to their final magazines. Sarah knew that the next enemy assault would likely be decisive one way or another. They simply didn't have the resources to repel another sustained attack. As she prepared her final defensive plan, she could hear the enemy regrouping in the darkness just beyond the perimeter, preparing for what they clearly believed would be their victory charge. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched endlessly, as Sarah and her remaining 7 soldiers faced what appeared to be their final stand. The enemy had grown bolder with each passing hour, sensing that the defenders were reaching the limits of human endurance. Voices in the darkness called out taunts and surrender demands in broken English, psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of the exhausted defenders. Sarah moved from position to position in a crouch, checking on each of her soldiers and redistributing the last remaining ammunition to ensure that every defender had at least one full magazine for the final assault. The mathematics of their situation were stark. They faced overwhelming odds with no hope of reinforcement or resupply before daybreak at the earliest. Wilson intercepted a series of enemy radio transmissions that revealed the insurgents' growing impatience with their inability to overrun such a small defensive force. Their commander was under pressure from higher authorities to complete the mission quickly, and Sarah realized that this urgency might lead to tactical mistakes she could exploit. The enemy's next assault came just after 2 a.m, with a ferocity that surpassed everything that had come before. Dozens of fighters advanced from multiple directions simultaneously, supported by concentrated mortar fire that turned the night sky orange with explosions. The noise was overwhelming, making communication between defensive positions nearly impossible. Sarah found herself at the center of a hellish battle that tested every aspect of her training and leadership. She coordinated defensive fires while personally engaging enemy fighters who had penetrated to within grenade-throwing distance of her command position. The close-quarters combat was brutal and unforgiving, with both sides fighting with the desperation of soldiers who knew this might be their last battle. Sergeant Rodriguez was wounded again when shrapnel from a mortar round tore through his right arm, but he continued fighting with his rifle held awkwardly in his left hand. His example of stubborn determination inspired the younger soldiers to maintain their positions despite the seemingly hopeless odds they faced. The breakthrough nearly came when a team of enemy sappers managed to detonate an improvised explosive device against the eastern wall of the compound. The explosion created a gap large enough for assault troops to exploit, and only the quick reaction of Private Martinez prevented the position from being overrun completely. As the enemy poured through the breach, Martinez emptied his magazine into the advancing fighters at point-blank range, before drawing his sidearm and continuing to engage targets with deadly accuracy. His heroic stand bought precious seconds for Sarah to organize a counterattack that sealed the breach with concentrated fire from multiple positions. The battle raged through the darkest hours of the night with an intensity that seemed to defy human endurance. Sarah had long since lost track of how many enemy attacks they had repelled, focusing entirely on the immediate tactical situation and the welfare of her soldiers. Each successful defense came at a cost in ammunition and casualties that brought them closer to the inevitable conclusion. Wilson's monitoring of enemy communications revealed increasing frustration among the insurgent commanders. They had expected to overrun the position within hours, and the prolonged resistance was disrupting their broader operational plans. More importantly, Sarah learned that other friendly forces were beginning to respond to the situation, though help was still hours away. The psychological turning point came around 4 in the morning when the enemy's assault began to lose coordination and intensity. The insurgent fighters had been attacking continuously for over 10 hours, and even their superior numbers couldn't overcome the basic human need for rest and reorganization. Sarah seized this opportunity to reorganize her defenses and redistribute her remaining ammunition for maximum effectiveness. She also took the risk of sending a detailed situation report to headquarters via Wilson's radio, providing intelligence about enemy strength and tactics that would be valuable for the relief force. The response from command brought both hope and additional pressure. A quick reaction force was en route but wouldn't arrive until after sunrise at the earliest. More critically, reconnaissance flights had detected additional enemy reinforcements moving toward the battle area, suggesting that the insurgents were committed to achieving victory regardless of the cost. As the first faint light of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, Sarah realized that her small force had achieved something remarkable. They had survived through the night against overwhelming odds, and had prevented the enemy from achieving their primary objective. However, the arrival of daylight would bring new challenges as enemy reinforcements reached the battlefield. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and Sarah knew that the next few hours would determine whether her soldiers' incredible sacrifice had been enough to save the village and hold the position until relief arrived. The enemy was preparing for one last, desperate assault designed to crush the remaining resistance before friendly reinforcements could intervene. Sarah gathered her exhausted soldiers for what might be their final briefing. Looking into their dirt-streaked faces, she saw not defeat but determination. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to give up now, regardless of what the enemy might throw at them in these crucial final hours. Dawn broke over the battlefield, revealing a scene of incredible destruction. The once neat outpost was barely recognizable, with shattered walls, burned equipment, and crater holes marking 12 hours of continuous combat. Sarah surveyed the damage with eyes that burned from smoke and exhaustion, but her spirit remained unbroken despite the overwhelming odds she and her 7 remaining soldiers continued to face. The enemy had used the pre-dawn hours to bring up their heaviest weapons, including what appeared to be a captured military howitzer that could destroy the remaining defensive positions with direct fire. Sarah realized that this final assault would be unlike anything they had faced during the long night of desperate fighting. Wilson's radio crackled with intercepted enemy transmissions that revealed the insurgents' determination to finish the battle before friendly reinforcements could arrive. Their commander had committed every available fighter to this ultimate attack, gambling everything on one overwhelming assault that would crush the remaining resistance through sheer force of numbers. The artillery barrage began at exactly 6 in the morning, systematically destroying what remained of the outer defensive perimeter. Sarah ordered her soldiers to take cover in the deepest bunkers, while the enemy attempted to soften their positions for the infantry assault that would inevitably follow. As the bombardment intensified, Sarah made radio contact with the approaching relief force. The quick reaction team was still 2 hours away, but the commander promised that attack helicopters would arrive within 30 minutes to provide close air support. Sarah knew that her small force had to hold out just a little longer to achieve final victory. The enemy's climactic assault began with over 50 fighters advancing from all directions simultaneously. This was their entire remaining strength committed to a single, decisive attack designed to overwhelm the defenders before air support could arrive. Sarah could see that many of the advancing insurgents were wounded from earlier fighting, but were still determined to complete their mission. The battle that followed was the most intense of the entire engagement. Sarah and her soldiers, though vastly outnumbered and nearly out of ammunition, fought with the fury of cornered lions. Every shot had to count, and every decision carried the weight of survival for not just themselves but for the villagers they had sworn to protect. Sergeant Rodriguez, despite his wounds, managed to eliminate an entire enemy squad that had penetrated to within meters of the command bunker. His accurate rifle fire and tactical expertise proved decisive in preventing what could have been the final breakthrough that ended their resistance. The sound that Sarah had been praying for finally echoed across the battlefield, the distinctive rotor noise of approaching attack helicopters. The enemy fighters, so close to victory just moments before, suddenly found themselves exposed on open ground as the aircraft appeared on the horizon, with weapon systems ready to engage. The psychological effect on the insurgent forces was immediate and devastating. After fighting for over 12 hours against what should have been an easy victory, they now faced fresh enemy forces with overwhelming firepower. Their coordinated assault began to collapse as individual fighters sought cover or attempted to withdraw from the killing zone. Sarah coordinated with the helicopter pilots to ensure that their attacks were precisely targeted to avoid hitting friendly positions or civilian areas. Her tactical guidance proved invaluable as the aircraft systematically destroyed enemy positions and scattered the remaining insurgent forces across the surrounding terrain. The relief column arrived just as the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, bringing fresh troops, medical supplies, and ammunition to the battered outpost. Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that she had been suppressing throughout the long night of combat. But her first concern was for her soldiers and the civilian population they had been protecting. The aftermath revealed the true scope of what had been accomplished during those 12 relentless hours. Intelligence reports confirmed that the enemy force had numbered over 80 fighters at the start of the battle, making the odds nearly 7-1 against the small defending unit. The insurgents had committed their best troops and most sophisticated weapons to what they believed would be a quick and decisive victory. Instead, Sarah and her soldiers had achieved something that military historians would later describe as extraordinary. They had not only survived against impossible odds, but had prevented the enemy from achieving any of their primary objectives. The village remained secure, no friendly forces had been lost, and the insurgent organization had suffered crippling losses that effectively ended their operations in the region. As medical personnel treated the wounded and fresh troops took over defensive positions, Sarah reflected on the courage and determination that her soldiers had displayed throughout the battle. Each one had performed far beyond what anyone could have reasonably expected, proving that the human spirit could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. The official reports would document the tactical details of the engagement, but they could never fully capture the personal cost of those 12 hours. Sarah had led her soldiers through the darkest night of their lives and had emerged victorious through a combination of tactical skill, personal courage, and an unbreakable determination to never surrender. Years later, when asked about that night, Sarah would always emphasize that the victory belonged to every soldier who had stood their ground when retreat seemed like the only reasonable option. They had believed she couldn't last, but together they had proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes rise to meet history's greatest challenges.